Hello, my Belfast Thousand Nation. How's everyone doing today? Hopefully everyone's having a great day. If not, I hope it gets better from here. We are back with another Coffeehouse Crime. This one is titled Delusional Man Snaps into Killer Samurai. This was actually suggested to me by a viewer. I'm excited. I love it when y'all request things. All right. I'm excited to get into today's story. If you guys are excited as I am, go ahead, turn them lights down low, put on something comfy, cup of something special. Let's get intrigued.
On a warm summer's night in January 2003, the city of Auckland faced a series of brutal attacks, and the details behind them were so disturbing that bystanders looked almost as shocked as the killer. Antonie Dixon's deplorable actions are utterly inexcusable. But the more we look into this monster's history and what he faced growing up, we realize just how doomed he was from the outset. So, today, let's dive into the life of the so-called Auckland Samurai, the many victims that he met along the way, and the unexpected surprises he revealed behind bars.
Dude, what?
Welcome back to Coffeehouse Crime, folks. My name is Adrian, and today we're traveling to New Zealand to look at one of the wildest stories I've ever come across. Now, this one will really make you think about the difference between nature versus nurture, because the monster of this story really did have all of the odds stacked against him. By the way, if you like true crime or dark stories, then please consider subscribing. Thank you. And now, with that said, please grab yourself a coffee and let's caffeinate while we investigate. This is the case of Antonie Dixon.
And as I always say, if you haven't already, think about going over to the B5 Nation store. Grabbing yourself a B5
Throw yourself
mug.
Across the Pacific Ocean, and with a little bit of luck,
we got many
you will
different
find yourself on the
designs.
shoreline of two of the...
Pause that. If you haven't already, go over and check out the B5 Nation store. Check out the stuff we have over there. Got some amazing coffee cups. Boom. This here's my original. It's my favorite. I got some other ones I love too, but I love my first one. Like, I do. Got some nice designs. Just put up some new ones. Got, go check it out. Go check it out.
World's most beautiful islands. And of course, I'm talking about New Zealand. So on that note, welcome to Auckland, folks. As the country's most populous city, Auckland is a diverse place with a melting pot of cultures. Located on the Northern Island, it is also known as the City of Sails, due to the many yachts that dot its shorelines and harbours. The city's volcanic origins have left a landscape dotted with dormant volcanoes, this including Mount Eden and Rangitoto Island, which are both incredibly popular spots for hiking and sightseeing. The surrounding Hauraki Gulf is also home to many islands, including Waiheke Island, which is renowned for its many vineyards and scenic beauty. Now, of course, we must stop and pay our respects to the indigenous population, the Maori people. Maori, also known as the indigenous people of Aotearoa, represents 19% of New Zealand's 4.7 million population.
Really?
Much like the Aboriginal and Torres Straits Islander peoples of Australia, I find their culture and ways of living to be absolutely extraordinary. And for many of us, that fascination does often begin with the haka. It's safe to say that Auckland is way more than just a city. It's a place where the energy of a bustling urban hotspot meets the tranquility of nature. And this place offers a lifestyle that is as dynamic and ever-changing as it is naturally rewarding. So, whether you're drawn by its scenic beauty, cultural vibrancy, or economic opportunities, Auckland is a city that will easily captivate your heart and your soul. However, scaling back to January the 21st, 2003, the peace and tranquility found across Auckland was destroyed by a gruesome series of attacks. But before we discuss the tragedies that occurred on that fateful day, let us first discuss those involved, and that takes us to the small town of Pipiroa. Found out in the sticks and southeast of Auckland lies a small rural community named Pipiroa. Now, the town has always been incredibly small. I mean, back in the early 2000s, it had a population of just 99 residents. Nowadays, it's around 120, so still incredibly small. But 3 of those living in Piparoa back in the year 2003 and in a converted shed were Renee Gunby, Simone Butler, and Antonie Dixon. So, let us first begin with the ex-couple, Antonie and Simone. The two used to be in a relationship, but eventually settled into a friendship once things fell apart. Travelling back 3 years at the turn of the new millennium, and back when the two were still a couple, they lived in a home in the Marcus City coastal town of Beachlands. It was during this time that Simone worked for a shipping company, where Antonie was known to work on cars and also practice his martial arts on the front lawn. Sadly, arguments, mental health, and abuse would eventually drive the two apart, and by the middle of 2002, they were simply 2 friends who ran a car repair business together in the local area of Piparoa. Now, apparently, this converted workshop was an absolute mess. It was littered with graffiti, horrendously messy and disorganized, and didn't have anything worth any value. However, despite not holding anything expensive, the workshop was guarded by several surveillance cameras, double slide bolt doors, barred windows, and an entire arsenal of weapons. This included several bats, knives, illegal firearms, and a single samurai sword. We'll get back to all of that in a short while, but the key thing to note here is that Antonie was extremely paranoid about his safety. Anyway, Antonie and Simone managed to get by with this business with relative comfortability. But locals did know Antonie as a hothead who often ranted about life. It was in November of 2002 that Antonie would cross paths with another woman named Renee Gunby, and shortly after meeting, she would actually move in with him and Simone into the workshop. You see, Renee was in a very abusive relationship at the time, and so when Antonie offered her a place to stay, well, she jumped at the chance. And so, within only a couple weeks of knowing each other, off she went to move into this place with both him and another woman. But just because Renee had managed to escape her abusive ex-partner, that doesn't mean that she was out of the woods just yet. No, in fact, sadly, she had just downgraded from a dangerous household to a lethal one. It was on her very first day at the new workshop that Antonie reportedly picked up one of his
crazy
firearms
face, man.
and then proceeded to shoot out a
more than
window
crazy
to the
eyes.
side of Renee's head. She perceived Antonie's actions as just
like a
fooling
little
around
Goomba.
and showing off. And the truth is that he probably likely was too. But unknown to her at the time, the man was an incredibly paranoid, antisocial, violent, and unstable person. He would become quite possessive over the weeks too. But by the time she realized how unhinged
you should
he
have
really
been able to
was,
tell by the
she was
hairdo that he
unfortunately
was a
in too deep.
fucking weirdo,
And
bro.
by then, the two had started some kind of strange relationship together. You see, Antonie would often take her phone away and would never let her out of his sight. Put quite bluntly, he was controlling her, and Renee was slowly starting to feel it. And that's when his paranoid behaviour started to show too. You see, Antonie had been paranoid about many things in his life for a long time. But now he had grown attached to Renee, she too had become part of these paranoid thoughts. He began to accuse her of sleeping with police officers, who were all in on an elaborate scheme to take him down. And when she introduced him to her family, well, that is when he also started to believe that they were in on it too. Over the following weeks, Antonie became more agitated, more short-tempered, more erratic, and more violent.
More psychotic.
It escalated to the point that, by January 2003, Renee and Simone were living in fear. And sadly, on January the 21st, those fears would be realized in the most gruesome of ways.
Oh shit, it's about to get nasty.
All of it began the day prior. In an ever-worsening mental state, Antonie and Renee had driven to her mum's home to ask for support. Antonie was still ranting about her family working with the police to betray him, so Renee thought that maybe she could calm him down by working with him to find a counsellor. The mother and daughter had additional plans that day too. The family had plans to pick up a new car, and so, heading out to pick it up, they left Antonie home to wind down. This initially did not seem like a bad idea. However, shortly after leaving the property, Renee looked in the rearview mirror to see him speeding behind them, weaving through traffic with tires screeching and lights flashing. Renee felt bad for Antonie, who seemed desperate to have her back. And so, in a moment of weakness, she decided to leave her mum in the car and go back home with him. The two of them left Auckland, travelling back to Piparoa and to Antonie's shed. However, little did she know that this would have dire consequences for her. Antonie's mood never improved. The following day, Antonie and Renee were alone at home while Simone was out with a friend. Antonie had spent most of the morning in a rather agitated state, but things really would take a turn for the worse after he made himself a hot bath. In the other room, Renee could hear him talking to her about the messages he had received from Allah. She had no idea what he was talking about, but allegedly all of this was her fault, and he was not afraid to tell her. That is when he suddenly got out of the bath, grabbed a hammer, and hit Renee's hand so hard that bone broke through her skin. And in that moment, she realized that suddenly she was in grave trouble. Renee tried to downplay the situation, but sadly, it was all too late. She was now more than just a spectator of the violent state he was in, and unfortunately, it would not stop here either. Soon after the initial attack, Simone returned home to find Antonie in a highly distressed state. That is when he immediately turned on her too, accusing her of sleeping with the police, and that, furthermore, she was also trying to poison him. Simone denied these insane allegations and reminded him how long they had known each other, but sadly, he didn't listen. Just moments later, Antonie grabbed his samurai sword and then charged towards both women. Antonie then attacked both Renee and Simone with the samurai sword. Through all of this commotion, Renee's left hand was entirely sliced off, and as for Simone, both of her hands were partially severed off too. Their injuries were so aggressive and horrific that the samurai sword had actually shattered in the process. Detectives would later learn that, if it hadn't shattered, Antonie planned to slice both of their heads off too. But when this failed, Antonie instead grabbed his submachine gun and then fled the property, leaving both women alive but deeply injured and traumatized. He then drove 55 miles north.
And no way to call 911. Too soon?
Northwest to the city of Auckland with one goal in mind. You see, Antonie had just committed more than one terrible crime, and he was not prepared to go back to prison. And so, his plan was rather simple. Antonie wanted to initiate a shootout with officers to, quote, go out in a blaze of glory. But first, he needed to grab their attention somehow. And unfortunately, the best way for him to do that was to target an innocent civilian and murder them in cold blood. Unaware of the chaos that was unfolding around him, a young man named James D'Alte was walking through Highland Car Park. At 25 years old, James was a family man who found himself in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had left his wife and 3 children at home to head to the supermarket with his friend and cousin. And tragically, it was in those relaxing moments that he was mercilessly gunned down by Antonie, completely unaware of who he was or what he was up to. Now, thankfully, both his friend and his cousin escaped unscathed. But for James, it was all too late. His injuries were not ones that you could ever come back from, but Antonie, he had already moved on. Meanwhile, a passerby who saw the attack phoned the police to report that he had just seen a man mow someone down with a submachine gun. Not only that, but he bravely followed Antonie long enough to get a description of his face and his car's license plate. And as you can imagine, this would be vital information for the police who would use it within the coming hours. Throughout the night, Antonie prowled the streets of Auckland, driving 4 miles from Pakurunga to Howick until, eventually, officers tracked his vehicle down. It was in that moment that both parties exchanged a hail of bullets until police decided to back off in an effort to mitigate civilian casualties. Whoa. With that said, Antonie once again slipped into the darkness of the night. That would be until a couple of hours later, when he was spotted trying to break into a property in East Tamaki, about 5 miles south of Howick. And although he had failed to get into this property, he then made his way next door before taking 2 others hostage. For the next 5 hours, negotiators fiercely tried to talk Antonie out of his madness. I mean, nobody wanted to see any more casualties come from this already gruesome night. But at this point in time, they had no idea which way this would go. Thankfully,
it's going to shit real fast.
6 a.m. and after a few terribly anxious hours, Antonie decided to finally give himself up to officers. Stepping out of the property, he held his hands high, where the police then arrested and detained him. And with Antonie's trail of destruction finally coming to an end, officers could now work their way backwards and try to piece together what precisely happened. Beginning with Simone and Renee, paramedics from St. John's Ambulance were called to the property shortly before 7:30 p.m. They were called to visit a workshop found on Buchanan Road following claims that a man had fallen off of a roof. However, once they got there, they found a vastly different scenario. Both Simone and Renee were found in a pool of their own blood, with a broken samurai sword nearby. It is noted that they were both alive, but in a very concerning state. In fact, the doctor and ambulance staff who attended all said that both women were only minutes away from dying. Despite surgeons' best efforts to reattach Renee's right hand, her body ultimately rejected it after a 6-hour operation. But despite this loss, she thankfully stabilized and was eventually taken out of an intensive care unit. Simone was rather lucky too. Both of her hands were almost entirely cut through. In fact, her right hand was so close to being cut off that her thumb, index and middle fingers were all hanging by a 1 centimeter wide piece of skin. Yet, despite her horrifying injuries, both hands were successfully reattached, and she would go on to regain full function of them. The same level of success could not be said for James, and tragically, he was pronounced dead by sunrise, leaving behind a wife and 3 children. The poor guy had sustained 10 bullet wounds to his back, with enough lead to destroy his spine and puncture both lungs. And with his death happening so publicly, well, all eyes were now on Antonie and how he would be punished. However, before we get to Antonie's trial, I would say it is probably worth looking at his childhood and his mental health. Because honestly,
I don't want to.
His story is probably the worst I've ever heard. In fact, he had suffered so much abuse and trauma that you can't help but feel sorry for the child in him. Now, of course, I cannot say the same thing for the adult or monster he became. But this story really is a compelling case for nurture over nature. So, without any further ado, let us dive into the world of Antonie's younger years. Born in 1968, Antonie was always going to be a disturbing yet sad wildcard in this story. And that's because, although he would ultimately become an evil monster, you can quite easily see that he and his upbringing really did not stand a chance. You see, Antonie unfortunately suffered terrible abuse throughout his childhood. His mother, who was a devout member of the Jehovah's Witness Church, often physically and verbally abused him, quoting biblical verses while she hit, beat, and violated her son. His father was not in the picture either. Likely repulsed by his mother, he would also sadly pass away when Antonie was only 10 years old. This meant that, alongside his sister, he was at the mercy of his mother's evil actions. And because he was the younger of the two, he often received the brunt of her evil. As a result, Antonie was often chained up to a clothesline in the garden, just like a dog. His mother, who often referred to him as the spawn of the devil, was not the only one to beat him either, as she would often call the so-called brothers of the church around her place to help out. Antonie was also forced to be part of pornographic movies and photo shoots made by a friend of the family, who, since then, has been found guilty. To add to this, his mother would routinely sexually abuse him too. In fact, it is estimated that around 20 adults were guilty of this. It is also reported that Antonie could only bark as a child, leading him to believe that he could telepathically speak with dogs. His mother would also padlock him to a fence and ridicule him, instilling a powerful feeling of low self-esteem and self-worth. Put quite bluntly here, his animal of a mother would never let up on her barrage of abuse. And quite understandably, this severely hindered his chance of a stable and happy lifestyle. At the tender age of 10 years old, Antonie was institutionalized. From here on out, his mental health problems became much more evident as he moved through his teenage years. Therefore, as did the frequency with which he was punished for his crimes. Living in a household where the discussion of demons was a regular and natural thing, the young boy started to believe that he had inherited his father's demons, when, in reality, the source of all of his problems was actually just his mother. As a direct result of the abuse, he struggled with his sexuality, But fortunately, Antonie would never go on to inflict the same kind of thing back onto others.
Thank God for that.
But the real damage done was paranoia. You see, Antonie believed that he was being closely watched and followed by pretty much everyone, and that furthermore, the police and government were out to get him. This even included him believing that commercial aircraft in the sky were actually following him, of course including buses, cars and pedestrians. And so, from here on out, a very problematic and violent young man was created.
Okay.
In fact, over the following years, he accumulated more than 150 convictions. Many of these convictions were over theft and burglary, but there were several drug-related charges too. In total, he would be jailed 14 times throughout the years, doing many small stints behind bars. Antonie was well known in the area to take methamphetamine quite often, and many of the locals knew him as unpredictable, aggressive, and extremely paranoid. It is widely believed that during his time with Simone and their relationship, Antonie just about kept himself together. But by the time he became single, the drugs had thoroughly cooked him. And of course, over the following months, we pretty much know what happened next. During his trial, Antonie primarily claimed insanity as his defense. He appeared wild and wide-eyed with an unusual haircut, and photographs of his appearance were widely published in major newspapers around the world. His psychiatrist told the court that throughout both of his assessments with Antonie, he observed some rather strange abnormality in his mental state. Antonie spoke about wanting to take his own life and murder other people, and he was both obsessed and convinced that he was at the center of a conspiracy. Those who knew Antonie spoke of his moods as similar to being possessed, and some believed that he had multiple personalities. Some of his former partners would talk about him being physically abusive towards them, where others spoke about how he sometimes foamed at the mouth whenever he was in one of his episodes. A medical examination of Antonie concluded that he was high on pure methamphetamine, also known as P, during the time of the attack. Now, this could explain some of the impulsiveness of his actions,
fucked up on P?
and even the delusions he was experiencing at the time. However, of course, the drugs do not nullify or excuse his actions.
No.
And so, ultimately, Antonie was found guilty of murder, wounding, kidnapping, shooting at police, and aggravated burglary. As a result, he received a life sentence with a minimum non-parole period of 20 years. And just a side note here, but he was acquitted of 5 charges of attempted murder. Nevertheless, Antonie appealed his conviction to the Court of Appeal of New Zealand, arguing that the trial judge failed to properly instruct the jury on the law relating to insanity, and that, furthermore, the jury should have had the option of a manslaughter verdict. To many people's surprise, the Court of Appeal overturned his convictions on September 7th, 2007, therefore ordering a retrial in the following year. This retrial began in June of 2008, ending 2 months later on July 30th, 2008. However, yet again, the jury found him guilty, and so, as a result, Antonie was remanded in custody, pending sentencing on February 5th, 2009. It is reported that he intended to appeal the second trial's outcome too. However, and this is a very big however by the way, but on February 4th, 2009, and only 1 day before his scheduled resentencing, Antonie was found dead in his cell. Forensic officers concluded that Antonie had successfully taken his own life behind bars, therefore avoiding his resentencing. It was also noted that Antonie was seen by a psychiatrist only a few hours before his death, and that a psychiatrist thought that he looked unwell and needed urgent supervision and medical assistance. Well, it was too little too late, because only a few hours later, Antonie was found with fatal neck and head injuries. In addition to this, and rather quite curiously, but on the day of his death, his lawyer had actually told prison guards that Antonie had not taken his medication, and that, furthermore, he reported that he'd been beaten up by several inmates in the days prior. So it looks like Antonie was thrown into the dark seas of grief and forced to relive the abuse that he'd experienced as a child. So this very well could have thrown him over the edge, but then again, he did kind of say that he intended not to go back to prison.
That he did.
So here are a few additional side notes, but Antonie actually tried to attack his lawyer only days before his death. He did this by concealing a makeshift weapon which he hid in his shoe to try and stab him. He also tried to blind a fellow inmate by gouging his eye out with a fork, which later required hospitalization. And although it's not known if the eye survived or not, it is clear to see that Antonie was in a very aggressive, paranoid, and unwell state of mind. Now, it's worth noting here that, regardless of the problematic childhood that Antonie experienced, many others go through the same cycle of abuse and choose to break the generational chain instead.
Yep.
And sadly, as a result of all of this, James Taoute, the most prominent victim of this terrible story, should still be alive
Gotta break
today.
the cycle, bro.
James left behind a partner and 3 children, ages 8, 4, and 1 year old. His death was entirely senseless, and left many people with an open wound for the rest of their lives. James is described as very open and forthcoming to people. He was a devoted father, a terrific partner, and a real family man. And it's a real tragedy that he can't be with them today. Now, surprisingly, Renee and Simone both kept in touch with Antonie after his arrest. This obviously changed after his death in 2008, which is probably a good thing. I guess you could say that the distance could now allow them to emotionally heal. When asked why she held on to him for so long, Simone answered, "I thought that with love and compassion, patience and understanding, I could make him good and well and happy and balanced." Simone no longer thinks about her ex-partner, but she does advocate for a safer world for women and partners in abusive relationships. Sadly, in March of 2016, Renee was arrested after a covert police investigation called Operation Bunk targeted a methamphetamine distribution chain. She pleaded guilty to 9 charges of possession or supply of the Class A drug, totaling 382 grams over 3 months, and 2 charges of possessing iodine, which is used in the manufacturing process. Hopefully, she has now been rehabilitated and will remain out of trouble. And on a lighter note, and in rather typical New Zealander humour, I guess someone had to go ahead and make this for a movie poster. But don't hold your breath. I don't think we're going to see this in cinemas anytime soon. I do have to say that the artwork is pretty good though. Anyway folks, I'm going to wrap this case up here today, but before...
Alright. I really enjoyed that. Hopefully y'all enjoyed it as much as I did. If you did, please go down there, leave a thumbs up. It really does help the channel grow. Damn, that was good. Oh, while you're down there, if you want, go on over, slap that subscribe button, become part of the B5 Nation. We do some crazy stuff here. If you want to know when that crazy stuff happens, ding that bell. Turn on all post notifications. As always, be good to one another. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye. Damn. Like, I do feel bad. No child should ever have to do that. But I don't feel bad for the grown-ass man that did what he did. Like, damn, Adrian. See, this is why I love Coffeehouse Crime. Fucks you up.